Greetings, YouTube. You're here with me, Elizabeth, Paula and Catherine, and we have a very special and interesting guest for you today, sexual freedom campaigner, free speech activist, and author of the fantastic, if concerning, book, Porn Panic, Sex and Censorship, Jerry Barnett. And
Thanks.
I'm getting a repeat. Has anyone got the video playing in the background?
It might be me.
Welcome, Jerry.
Hey, Elizabeth and Paula and Catherine. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. If you don't mind, I'd actually like to start with a bit about your personal history and heritage, because it's really fascinating.
I guess I start the book with my grandfather's history. So my grandfather was the son of Jewish immigrants in the East End. He came from a poor family. He left school at 14, and he became an anti-fascist activist, which was may not be the coolest kind of label in 2018, but it was certainly a cool thing to be in 1936 in the East End of London. And he was at the famous Battle of Cable Street, where the locals in the East End prevented Mosley's black shirts from marching through the East End. And he joined the Communist Party in the 1930s, which was a lot of Jews and a lot of people on the progressive left joined the Communist Party at that point, because they were the only grouping that really took fascism seriously and that saw fascism as a threat. You have to remember, kind of pre-war, fascism didn't have the same, people didn't have the same kind of idea of the word fascism and what it stood for in the 1930s. And he was a communist till 1956. A lot of communists left the Communist Party in 1956 because the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. And that was when a lot of people really woke up to the fact that the Soviet Union wasn't the happy, progressive place that some people still thought it was. And that radicalism is in my heritage. My mum was an activist. I went on kind of a lot of the marches and things of the 70s, including I'm fairly sure I went on some kind of feminist march as a kid. My mum was a second wave feminist, a woman's libber for a little while, as were her friends, and I grew up in that kind of environment. And then I myself went on to become an activist. I joined. I went on anti-racism marches from the late 70s. There was a grouping called the Anti-Nazi League. There was a movement called Rock Against Racism. So there were some amazing free concerts. And you have to realize, racism was a real problem back then. And the far right were a real problem. And Black and Asian people genuinely, were in danger of walking through the cities on their own at that point. And then I a little later, when I was about 16, I joined a Trotskyist, a far-left grouping called the Militant Tendency, which was embedded within the Labour Party. And I read Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and Engels and got a real grounding in left-wing politics. And I always kind of identified as on the left. The left was a far more diverse and interesting group of people than people might see it today. There was a very strong, there were a lot of people with very strong kind of libertarian and anarchistic instincts on the left at that point. And really, I was an activist. I then I managed to get my girlfriend pregnant while I was doing my A-levels. So kind of that kind of, there's a good chance I would have become a full-time activist far left activist in the Labour Party, if not. So it probably saved me. But what really changed the left, there was a moment, and the miners' strike was the moment that the old left, the industrial left, thought that they could stop Margaret Thatcher and that they could reverse her market reforms, and the miners went on strike. And the miners being super powerful in the past, And, and this strike went on for a year, and it was a big deal. There was a lot of very vicious policing. There was a lot of solidarity around the country. A lot of people supported the miners. And I was going to a lot of conferences around that time. When the miners' strike was broken I think it was around the spring of 1985, that wasn't just the end of the strike or the end of that particular era. That was the end of the era of industrial militancy that went back a century before that founded the trade union movement and the Labour Party. And we all knew it. We knew that something fundamental had changed. And I drifted away from politics, and a lot of people did. And, lots of my friends stayed active, and some of them are still in the same group that they were 35 years ago. But something really changed. And, I was always kind of still leftish, and I was still involved in anti-apartheid, which was a big deal in the 80s. I was still involved in the movements against the far right, which still seemed like a threat in the 80s. But we went on with our lives. And it was only fast forwarding to 2008 with the financial crash that kind of this left wing, there was a resurgence of the left, and there was this feeling that, capitalism actually wasn't we'd kind of, a lot of us had, I'd set up a business and decided that capitalism wasn't a terrible thing. We'd once thought it was, that actually capitalism hadn't impoverished the world. It had actually made the world wealthier and made the world's poor wealthier in many ways. And it hadn't crushed freedom. It had actually increased the spread of democracy around the world in the intervening years and so on. So, and then in 2008, there was this moment of doubt, and this, actually is capitalism, with the Marxist right, is capitalism really got this built-in self-destruct that Marxists kind of thought. And so I kind of got re-involved. This time I started a blog, and I got involved, and I wanted, I found it interesting and exciting that young people were getting back into politics and into radical politics. And then there was this period for the next 2-3 years where I just started to worry about what has happened to the left. And in 2012, sorry, I wrote a blog post called "I Never Left the Left, the Left Left Me," just kind of expressing my disgust at what had happened to the left. And two things had happened. One was I was older and more experienced, and my views had changed. But the other thing was the left had fundamentally changed. And what had changed was that when the miners' strike ended and the trade union movement kind of imploded, the left had retreated into academia, into universities, into public service trade unions. It became quite middle class, and it changed fundamentally. Without the kind of industrial working class on board, the nature of the left changed, and identity politics started to grow. And I'd kind of ignored all that, and until 2012, I just had this kind of, what the fuck has happened to the left? Because this was my tribe in a way that more than it is to most people. I think this kind of, like I say, this was my family lineage going back to the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, and I felt kind of betrayed, and I started to look and examine and see what had gone wrong. The other thread that has happened was that I'd been running a technology business. I've been involved in technology since the 80s, in software technology, and I started a business in the mid 90s, and an internet software business, and kind of by accident, I ended up building a porn site for someone, and that had gone quite well. And then I ended up building some more porn sites, and then there was a dot-com crash in 2001 when the internet industry kind of imploded. And it turned out that the only customers I had that were making any money were the porn people. So I started working with more porn companies. And in 2004, I set up my own porn company. It was a Netflix type system. So basically I was streaming other people's content and charging for it. And through that, I kind of, I've always kind of been interested in activism, and I got interested in the sexual freedom movement and so on. And I started doing debates at university, and I found myself up against feminists, and that kind of unnerved me, because I'd always seen feminism. I'd kind of been out of touch with what had gone on since the 70s, but I'd seen feminism as a broadly liberal movement with broadly liberal aims. And again, there were these people with views that I basically considered to be fascist, who were standing up as feminists and calling for porn to be banned, and calling for and trying to, sex work to be banned, and claiming they were there to protect these poor women and so on. I knew a lot of sex workers, I knew a lot of porn stars, I knew, strippers. And so I was kind of joining this campaign on which the left was on the wrong side. It was feminists and trade unionists and the Labour Party, people in the Labour Party and so on, were trying to censor the internet, trying to close down strip clubs, completely claiming they were on the side, trying to rescue the poor women from the industry. But I knew full well that the women didn't want to be rescued. And so, yeah, that was really the turning point for me, about 2012, when I suddenly found myself, for all sorts of reasons, kind of against the left, which I'd always thought was my natural home.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much for that.
Can you just say it's
Is everybody getting an echo from me?
Hey, sorry, I didn't catch what you said, Paula.
Just how old are you?
I'm 52.
You're 52. All right, because I'm 48, so you're a little bit older than me.
Yeah.
And yeah, I kind of a lot of that kind of has echoes with kind of my experience as well, certainly. And I think just what you were saying,
Oh, I think I lost you there.
Yeah, sorry. I can just see you. I can see you talking, but I can't hear you. Has somebody got an echo? Has somebody got something playing in the background?
We've definitely got an echo. I'm going to check my computer.
Okay, my
It shouldn't be me or Catherine or Elizabeth, I guess, because we've got headphones on. But
yeah, no, it sounds like somebody's got the video playing in the background.
Yeah, I'm actually watching.
It's not me.
Myself on the wrong thing. but it is muted.
Try pausing it.
Okay. Excuse me, everybody. Is that better?
Let's talk a bit. It sounds like it's gone to me.
Yeah, I was just, because Jerry's what, 4 or 5 years older than me, and I just thought that was an interesting point what you said about the miners' strike. I lived in Easington in the northeast of England, where there were big kind of pitched battles between the miners and the police in the 80s when I was a teenager, and I know that obviously everybody in that area was born a socialist. You had to be socialist, and that was born out during the miners' strike. With people being taken to car parks and beaten, and kids being spat at school, and in the worst experiences, concrete blocks being dropped off from bridges into people's cars because there were scabs and things.
I remember that.
You weren't allowed to be an outlier in that kind of thing. And it was interesting that, looking at the history, that the miners didn't actually vote to go out. The trade unions took them out. And but just you saying there that after the miners' strike, the kind of the neo-Marxists lost their grassroots support base and had to kind of retreat into academia. That's an interesting point, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, the roots of identity politics were already there, but certainly as Marxists, kind of real Marxists, like my lot, we're kind of contemptuous of identity politics and very wary of it. So, I think identity politics of today has two strong roots. One is feminism and the other is black nationalism. And I was part of the anti-racism movement, but the anti-racism movement for a start, we did not accept the idea that only white people could be racist. That was absolutely seen as a racist viewpoint on the left. We didn't accept that there should be any hierarchy, that black people should have a greater voice than white people, that because of their so-called oppression.
Well, I remember I went to college at the time, and I remember having my Black consciousness poster stuck on my folder. I remember, you know, kind of Biko and Nelson Mandela's really massive kind of thing. There were the kind of the boycotts to South Africa and all of these things. I mean, we would turn on the news and see people being necklaced, and which is it's nothing compared to kind of what you see. Things were on the 6 o'clock news, and as a child seeing those kinds of things, it was pretty horrific. And we've come a long way since then. So it's kind of funny that, you know, I grew up in that kind of quite kind of corralled kind of leftist progressive perspective as well, and still have those kinds of liberal kind of views in that kind of sense, in the sense of, you know, kind of like humans are humans, and all humans deserve kind of basic respect and human rights and what have you. But yeah, the kind of the whole idea coming out of postmodernism that you're saying is of black people or people of color having some kind of magical kind of cloak of righteousness that kind of makes them not be party to kind of human frailty or human
and actually
weakness.
It's primarily middle class students, black and Asian and Arab people who are claiming this oppression and who are claiming this right. That, you know, it's this weird kind of upside down Alice in Wonderland thinking, where the more oppressed you claim to be, the more right you have to tell other people to shut up. Like I hadn't come across any of this, except, you know, I mean, we didn't see there were black nationalists around at the time, and we didn't see them as part of the left. They were as much reactionaries as the National Front and the white fascists. And I still see black nationalism like that. And if anything, black nationalism is kind of strengthened since those days, because the left, the anti-racism movement doesn't hold this in check. The anti-racism movement is only interested in white racism, which makes it a racist movement as far as I'm concerned. So I kind of see these twin strands of black nationalism and feminism, and actually they borrow from each other. And I think kind of coming more to the point of porn panic and things, you know, there's this great myth that gender feminism is built around the great myth of gender being an entirely social construct, and men and women basically being the same things that are just forced into difference by social. That's the great myth of feminism. Black nationalism has this equivalent myth of, it's kind of going off topic, but I find it interesting, of that all of Africa was black, and that Egypt was black, and that and the Middle East even was black, and that all of this belongs to black people, but was taken away at some
point. As if racism didn't kind of exist within the African continent, as if genetic diversity there's more genetic diversity within the African continent than there is without the African continent, which is something that black activists don't seem to understand, or racists as well.
No. There's this very simple story that Africa is black, and it isn't. There are at least 4 major racial groups in Africa. But I find the parallel with feminism interesting. The black nationalism and feminism are both built around these great myths, and I guess, you know, the one that's more of interest tonight is the great myth of gender. Of lack of gender difference.
It's all the same tactic and strategy, basically, isn't it? It's a kind of the kind of special. You've got the special sauce, so that makes you know, and it's like, I've kind of said this a couple of times on recently, where I've said, you know, so black people have a kind of special kind of cloak that protects them from being toxic, but doesn't protect them from the toxicity of others. You know, if that's that's some, you know, if that's some pretty strong magic, that you should sell that snake oil, because that would make you really powerful if that's true. If you're really are different.
And it's a complete reversal of progressive ideology.
Absolutely.
Because,
yeah,
as I say, the anti-racism in the 80s, people used to talk about reverse racism as if there were two types of racism, white against black being different to black against white. And we were always dead straightforward about it, that there is one type of racism, and it is bigotry by one person of one race against another person because of their race, regardless of their color. And the fact that that's been, I never really heard this black people can't be racist thing till about 2012 again. Presumably it had been brewing in academia for decades until it's spewed out. But literally, I didn't hear it in the political discourse till 2012. And it was one of the many things that made me worry about the left and where the left had got to. And I still stand on that point. You know, most of my social circle is black, and I have to have a lot of arguments with my friends these days. But, you know, white people are kind of scared to open their mouths, and they can't be. I think everybody has the right to assert their right to equality, and regardless of who they are.
That's another parallel with feminism, isn't it? Because, you know, in feminism, there's this idea that women can't be sexist. And they use that, sexism or indeed racism is prejudice plus power. That little equation that they use, that get out clause.
Yeah, but the power is as they define it. So you say, how do you measure this power? And they can't measure it. And, you know, having a scientific kind of background in education, the first thing I say is, if you're going to talk about power, what is this power? How do you define it, and how do you measure it? And if you can't measure it, then you're dealing with some kind of mystical religious construct.
Exactly. Generally, for feminists, it just seems to be, if women are not doing the same thing men are doing, then they're somehow less powerful or less capable. If feminists have no interest in women's actual interests, or talking about biology, they have no interest in female choice, you know, which is a huge, powerful evolutionary thing. That they're ignorant of it, and they don't want to know about it at the same time.
Yeah, and there's a lot of maliciousness, but yeah, I think one of the things, because I've always hated bullying and bigotry at a general level, and one of my drivers into this new activism was just the fact that people were bullying women for being porn stars, strippers. It was the whole thing started for me in 2012 again, when I interviewed two female friends, strippers who had joined Equity, the trade union, and started fighting back against a feminist group called Object, who were trying to close down their workplaces, and spreading loads of lies and saying it was that the presence of a strip club in a particular area increased the rape in that area, of which there was no evidence whatsoever, but they said it. But yeah, it's this. More and more, I've come to see this thing as a female civil war, and even though we're told it's about patriarchy and male oppression, actually we men are bystanders, and a lot of men are confused, because actually this is primarily a female on female.
It is female. It's female intersexual competition. If anybody reads Baumeister and Tweng's paper on the cultural suppression of female sexuality. And masses of other data. You know, feminism, and because feminism is so kind of anti-biology and anti anything that kind of tells you anything of use about kind of how people interact and why they interact in certain ways. They're completely ignorant of why. Of how they express themselves. But it's I think feminism is more so, even though it threatens men in the same way that, you know, when male intersexual competition becomes really intense in certain societies, there are females and children and bystanders are hurt by proxy and that, but the main kind of victims of that, which is a paper that I kind of co-authored with Marianne Fisher and Dave Kruger, I've forgotten his first name. But basically, the men are the main victims of intense male intersexual competition. We've never been in a situation in kind of Western civilization where female intersexual competition has been allowed to kind of run its course and see where it kind of leads in a kind of runaway scenario. And I think what we're seeing now, and certainly with feminisms eating each other, the intersectional feminism, radical feminism, all of these feminisms, they're all just kind of in this massive bait ball, just kind of feeding on each other in a massive frenzy for who knows what. But now in the wider media with kind of models and all of this kind of thing, it's becoming really kind of obvious that feminism is a movement to control female sexuality.
Yeah, and I think one of the facts of female sexuality is that there's a massive diversity. I think women are more diverse in their sexual responses than men. So you've actually got a war defined by biology of kind of less, however you want to put it, less sexual, less promiscuous women, perhaps attacking women who are more sexual, who are more promiscuous. And this is, as I say, why I see it as, to an extent, a female civil war.
There's a bigger distribution around the tails for women in sexuality than there is, whereas for genius and IQ, that happens to be with men. But for kind of sexuality and fluidity and that kind of sense, there is with women,
And I mean,
but I know Elizabeth's got something for you. I'll let her get in now.
So do you two not think that, the groups like Object who are campaigning to get strip clubs closed down and things like this, do you not think that's an attack on male sexuality with kind of female casualties?
It could be seen as either, I think. They certainly find men disgusting and brutish, and they find it, they see the strippers, if you take strip clubs as an example, they see strippers as traitors who give dirty, disgusting men what they want. But it's very much about commerce, and it's about women's careers. For men, men are consumers, and strippers are, in this case, are the providers. But
it's about sexual economics, and the price in sexual economics. The kind of the dollar is sex, and women are the gateholders, the gatekeepers of sex.
Absolutely.
So
and I believe
in biological.
I think I mean there's also the kind of there's a conservatism from the point of view that actually marriage is a much better earner than sex work and striptease and so on. That marriage is a lifelong secure contract, and with divorce laws and alimony and so on, it's guaranteed even if your husband leaves you. So there's certainly a view, and I think it's probably true, that promiscuity, promiscuous women, sex workers and so on reduce the incentive of men to get married, and reduce the value of marriage because they can get sex elsewhere. And actually in very sexually repressed societies, men are going to get married younger if that's where they can find sex. So there's definitely an economic competition there as well.
Which is an odd kind of I think unforeseen consequence of feminists wanting more women to go to university. We find the kind of operational sex ratio on university campuses skewed towards the male. There are men on university campuses now, which means, as we know, because we it's operational sex ratio is not a new science. We know a lot about it. When you get more women and less men, the women are going to compete harder to get the good men, and then they're going to squabble about the shit men on Tinder, and none of them are going to be happy. But they're going to be playing by the male. They're going to be forced to play the male game.
It's also
it happens in kind of New York and big cities like that, but all these women are really unhappy. They're kind of, and they're looking to settle down, but they can't because there's just that there aren't the men there to feed the need. And
It's
this
also,
is an interesting consequence of feminism pushing women into those kinds of and upending the kind of sex ratio.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because even though, yeah, women have flooded into academia, they flooded into different sections of academia to where you typically find men. Having worked in technology, in software and so on for years, I know that most software computing departments on campus, and also software engineering departments in companies, and I've been both a software engineer and an employer of software engineers. You can't find that many good female software engineers, and I've tried, you know, because I when I was an employer, I wanted to recruit women to try and balance out the workplace a bit. Male engineers.
The one woman who works in the software kind of that industry is the woman with many choices. She's got the power to kind of set the rules of the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the 500 women and the 100 men in university campuses in liberal arts colleges, you know, that puts the females at the disadvantage in the operational sex ratio. Yeah.
And having seen kind of the kind of smelly blokes kind of sitting in computer labs late at night in all male computer labs, you can understand why men might go into the arts. There's at least one good incentive to do that.
Yeah. But they shouldn't at the minute. They should all go to kind of really geeky tech jobs.
There was an interesting study, I think in Freakonomics or Freakonomics 2, Super Freakonomics, where they looked at men and women going into MBA programs, and that was really interesting because that's fairly balanced. This is business where you get more of a male-female balance, and you know, women can be as good as men in leading business careers. But what they found was that women on MBA programs were marrying the men on MBA programs and quitting the course, and which is a really smart strategy. That may upset feminists, but it's kind of like,
of course it is.
It's not fun being a CEO.
And progressives do not give women, you know, the credit for making sound, you know, economic, evolutionary, fitness, common sense decisions, and the men that they're marrying as well, because they're making a mutual kind of trade-off here. They're both kind of doing, you know, getting together for the purpose of, you know, being married and procreating and building a family together. And that's the most efficient way that it has been done since forever.
Yeah, and you know, if you want to pick good genetic stock, then picking someone who's with an MBA, male or female, is a pretty good way of finding someone with good genes. But I mean, you know, and you know, I certainly wouldn't agree with some of the MRA people who think that men are somehow forced into these roles and things. Men who go into CEO positions and work 80-hour weeks and fly around the world and never see their family and never have social lives, they do that because they love that kind of thing. They love the power.
They're driven, aren't they? They're driven. Yeah. Those are people who do that. You can't do that. And then they pair up with people who can tolerate that at the same time.
Recently, Helena Morrissey has published a book. She's like CEO of some investment company, and it's all about how she's managed to have this high-flying career, but also have 9 children.
Wow.
And she basically, in this book, she basically did it by having a wife. Her husband, I mean, they had a full-time nanny for 20 years as well, but her husband is some Buddhist person that stayed home with the kids. So, I mean, obviously both parents could have been at work and the kids could have.
I think I wrote something a few years ago about one businesswoman of the year, and for 1 year was a trans woman, a man who was living, but she had a wife who stayed at home. So it's kind of, she's basically a man who, I'm going to really offend people here, a man who put on a dress, went to work and followed his passions absolutely, but also had a female woman, cis woman, looking after the kids, and she, you know, because I'm going to respect his wishes, was awarded the Woman Deserved. I mean, it is ridiculous.
I mean, the trans thing is interesting and complex, and actually, I mean, I know trans people, male to female and female to male, and I mean, it's certainly from the point of view of growing up as a trans person, it seems to be possibly one of the most traumatic things you can go through, because your brain and you know, your biological sex and your brain's idea of what your gender is are mismatched, and that's, you know, from the people I know, that's utterly traumatic. So I'm quite happy to recognize people's chosen genders. You know, when you get into discussions, when you have to redefine man and woman to make activists happy, it starts to get silly. And certainly, I think a lot of the trans people I know don't see the trans activists as their representatives, and find the whole discussion silly. And even more silly,
I know they're really not. They don't appreciate what trans activists are doing at all. They you know, they just want to actually blend in and get on with their lives. They don't want to make a spectacle of themselves.
And even worse, the gender fluid people, which I call it trans blackface, because they're not trans, but they're kind of playing the role of being trans because it's cool, and they can add an extra oppression to their intersectional collection. You know, and I think actually, if anything, the whole gender fluid kind of movement, and the kind of redefining gender when you feel like it, actually does trans people a disservice, because, you know, trans people genuinely,
like an extended childhood that kind of is extended in throughout university.
And I know
university is a protected space in the same way that, you know, schools are a protected, and you're not an individual. You don't have responsibilities. You can play for a few more years. You can play and make, and you don't have to, you know, just make those hard decisions. You know, it's not like we grew up in our teenage years. You know, being a teenager is about being depressed about who you are. And some people have it more and worse than others, but that's basically the condition of being a teenager.
Yeah, and I think, well, I mean, the kind of gender, I've met a couple of gender fluid type people, both kind of in the sex work kind of area, and they're both characterized by being quite fairly privileged. As sex workers, they're also very well paid, and they don't have to answer to a boss and this kind of thing. And so they have the luxury of playing around with their gender identity and changing it like clothes. And it's certainly like a privilege. It's like a privileged game. And like I say, I've known some trans people that it's just, you know, it's heartbreaking what they went through growing up, especially older people who carried it for decades before they could understand and transition or whatever. It's almost like taking the piss out of trans people.
If I can, do you mind if I drag it back to the book, Paula? Have you got one more point to make?
No. Carry on.
Yeah, what I'd really like to talk about, the book, the fantastic book. There you go. One of the sort of most unsettling trends that I became aware of through reading your book is like the historic tendency for societies to ricochet between periods of sexual liberation and repression. So you talk about the prehistoric Venus figures, which were everywhere and then just disappeared, and written sexual expression in Mesopotamia, which disappeared. You talk about the Soviet Union, which was the first modern state to decriminalize homosexuality, but then they recriminalized it. And you shared that link the other day about Lenin's massacre of sex workers as well. And I'd like to quote one of your lines back to you from the book, because I think it's fantastic. You say that perhaps the only thing as universal in human society as a love of sex is a fear of sex. And having read your book, because we spoke about it between us before I read the book, didn't we? And I said, oh, I feel really, you know, positive about it. I think we're moving in the right direction. But now I feel really quite worried that we're really overdue a period of intense repression, and that there's warning signs popping up all over the place. So I'd like to know how concerned you are, and also I'd like you to describe some of the warning signs that we're seeing here and now in the UK.
Yeah, well, look, this is why I'm so passionate, and I find it so important, because this isn't about sexual freedom or the right of sex workers or the rights of strippers. I think Edie Lamore, who I quote in the book and who's a friend of mine, and she still strips. She's a stripper. She was a stripper activist, and she called herself the canary in the coal mine. And as I interviewed her in 2012, and she was kind of the basis for the story of the book, because they saw the anti-sex backlash coming before anyone else saw it coming. But yeah, and in the book, I make the point: sexual repression is a symbol of political repression. If you see sexual repression rising, then political repression is rising, and sexual freedom is probably the first casualty. And the book, partly because I was an anti-fascist activist and my grandfather was, partly because I'm Jewish, and so Jews are kind of brought up with this fear of fascism. We're kind of inoculated. We're kind of almost brought up to keep looking over our shoulder to see if the fascists are here. And it's kind of, the book is about fascism, and I see sexual repression as a symbol, as one symptom of rising fascism. But I try to be very precise about it and define what fascism is, because everything's fascism these days. And so I define fascism as a deep cultural backlash against the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is the birth of liberalism. So Enlightenment values are really boiled down to three things. One is liberty, and in particular free speech and free expression. The second is equality, and the third is reason. So each of those in turn. So liberty, so rising attacks on sexual expression, sexual freedom, and free speech are symptoms of a deep attack, of a deep distrust of liberty. And this isn't coming from above. This is coming from grassroots movements, especially on the left now, where people have decided that there's too much free speech, there's too much sexual freedom. And this is why things like Page 3 are important, and the ban on grid girls are important, because suddenly society, or not society, but these political movements of the left have decided that grid girls and Page 3 and strippers and lads mags and pornography are all nasty and icky and need to be covered up. And I defend those things as examples of liberty. The equality thing, so the first strand is attacks on liberty. The second strand is attacks on equality. And again, we've talked about how feminism and Black nationalism have become intensely anti-equal. The anti-racism movement has become a racist movement in which white people, instead of racists being the enemy, white people are the enemy. And there's a vast amount of racism among certain Black groups, Black nationalist groups, and so on, that just gets ignored on the left. And we don't have an anti-racism movement. What was the anti-racism movement has become a movement to attack white privilege. So equality is massively under attack, and most of all by the feminist movement. And the third thing is reason. And reason is really, the attack on reason is really this postmodern thing, the postmodern idea that you can define your own truth if the existing truth, if you find the existing truth offensive or unpleasant, or it just doesn't fit with your worldview. And certainly, I think reason is massively under attack. So so we talked about the idea that that genders can be, that if you bring up boys and girls together, that somehow the genders can be merged together, and that if there are differences in outcome between men and women, then that must mean that women are oppressed, and therefore the state must act. And you can clearly see that repression and tyranny is going to follow unless people accept that men and women are different. there will be repressive laws passed to try to force men and women to be the same, and you know, I think the gender pay gap is one example of this. But yeah, the attacks on reason are particularly worrying as a science kind of geek person. And like I say, I've mentioned the kind of black nationalist myths as well. The idea that we know now, without beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the ancient Egyptians were Caucasian. You know, we even have that. We now have genetic evidence of that since 2017, along with all the historical evidence of that. But at the same time, there's this rising belief that Egypt and North Africa and the Middle East was stolen from black people, and it's becoming unacceptable to teach actual history in university because it now offends that people who don't want it that way. So yeah, I think if the attacks on liberty, the attacks on equality, and the attacks on reason form the basis of real fascism, not skinheads, not Nazi salutes, not swastikas, not even necessarily white nationalists and so on. Real, genuine fascism, which is this ultra-conservative attempt to turn back the Enlightenment and to attack everything that society has achieved in the past 200 years. And that's what fascism was in the 1930s as well. And most people don't understand that. They just think it's about killing Jews or, gas chambers or military parades and the kind of things that Hitler did. Fascism is much deeper than that and much scarier than that. It's when society decides it doesn't like reality and tries to squish it into and create a new reality.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'd really like to underline that canary in the coal mine sort of aspect, actually, that, sexual freedom is the first one to go and then other freedoms fall like dominoes. I think that's really important. But I'd also like to kind of get into some of the just examples of where sexual freedom is under threat. So I'm thinking of, feminist activism like Object in UK Feminista. I'm thinking of page 3, the Grid Girls, the kissing ban. This these potential new rules from this actors union, I think it's Equity, where actors are going to have to pretend to kiss, and also the Digital Economy Act.
Yeah, well, the Digital Economy Act, because I was running porn sites, I closed down the porn business, by the way, in 2012. So I'm not involved with that anymore. But because I was there directly at the forefront of government attempts to censor the internet, I saw almost before anyone else what the government was trying to do to rein in internet free speech, internet freedom. And this was really another angle of the book. The fact was that what I called the porn panic was being whipped up by feminist groups primarily, as well as conservative and religious groups. But it was being used by authoritarians within the British state as an excuse to censor the internet. Now, the British state has always been very censorious, has always had way more control over TV and radio than most other democratic countries. And most people below a certain age, probably below 40, or even 45, probably don't remember how repressive it all was, because the internet came out of nowhere and blew a massive hole in the power of the British censorship state. So what I witnessed when I was running porn sites and really dealing with attempts to regulate porn was the early efforts within the British state to try and censor what was to censor the internet using pornography as an excuse. So there was a series of regulations rolled out from 2008, 7, 8 that I was directly involved with because I ran a site. They were voluntary. Then in 2010, they were made mandatory. and people simply, most porn companies left the UK in 2010, 11, 12. So that the regulators just wiped out the British porn industry, but they didn't have any effect obviously on the people's ability to consume porn, because 99% of it was already in the US, in Spain, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, and lots of other places. So what I started to worry about, and especially once I closed down my business, was that you could see the direction of travel of the censorship state, which was that, having stamped out the UK porn industry, the regulators then went back to the government and said, well, look, we've just tried to clean up the UK porn industry and they've all just moved overseas and they're just carrying on doing exactly what they were doing before. We need the power to block websites, to block content on the internet. And, you know, a few years ago, this was unthinkable. It was unthinkable that a democratic country. Yeah, exactly like China. You know, and I mean, if you wanted to get the people who mostly want to get content blocked are actually media corporations like Sony and Warner and so on, who actually want to clamp down on piracy. So the main blocks of content that have happened in the UK have been entertainment corporations going to court and against sites like the Pirate Bay and getting court orders to block particular websites. But what happened was they would get a court order against the piratebay.com, and then the Pirate Bay would come back on a new address 5 minutes later. So it was very expensive for them, and so on. There was no mechanism for a government body to just say, here's a list of websites which break UK law, block them. And the Digital Economy Act 2017, which I've been lobbying against for years, created the mechanism to block websites en masse. So since April 2017, when the act was passed, a government-approved body has the right to draw up a blacklist of websites that breach UK law and block them, as many websites as it wants. Now, that mechanism...
On what premise? On what?
Well, on the premise, in this current version of the law, it's that whether if they're pornographic and they're not age-verifying visitors. So this is why, again, I called it the porn panic, because they were using pornography to create a censorship institution, a censorship body. But it's worth pointing out their definition of pornography is so broad that it could cover any commercial website, even with one nude photo on it. So Page 3, Google Images, Twitter, all of these sites are porn sites under the definition of the Digital Economy Act. Nobody has noticed yet, really, because the act, even though the act is now law, it doesn't really come into force until about April or May this year. And then the shit's going to hit the fan. All hell is really going to break loose, because there are estimates that the initial, under the definition of porn they've created, that maybe 4 million sites will be on the first blacklist. So when this it's due to come in on, I think, 27th of April, even though it's running behind from what I've heard. So from one day in the next 2, 3, 4 months, 4 million websites are suddenly going to be blocked by ISPs. The ISPs will be forced to block them under the law. And unless you have a VPN or use the Tor browser or whatever, you won't be able to access these sites anymore. And they'll all be sexual sites in one way or another, except, as I say, that things like everything from Tumblr to Twitter to Google Images to...
Well, exactly. I mean, how do you pass pornography from erotica? And certainly at the minute, you know, anti-sex kind of anti-feminine feminists seem to be saying that the female form itself is pornographic.
Oh, we lost.
Yeah. Hey, did we lose someone?
Yeah.
Oh, you're back.
You back, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Page 3, the No More Page 3 campaign, which I cover in the book, was an example where, you know, Page 3 now still has models on, but they now have to wear bikinis. So they now wear a bikini top, as if, I mean, basically it was, you know, the sight of nipples.
Is it that hides their nubile, you know,
yeah, they're still pretty.
Sexual signals, as if you can't see. You know,
yeah.
You know, yeah. It still doesn't make men happy in the morning looking at them.
No, I mean, you can't see
And
nipples. But
a lot of women like to see fit women.
yeah, I mean, you can see that by looking in women's magazines.
It makes them, it reminds them of their youth.
Yeah, well, they both like to see fit women,
Yeah.
and they like to see see celebrities who are
They're-
overweight
they're
with
a bit
cellulite.
less kind of they're a bit certainly looking at female magazines, women like to torture themselves looking at females who have kind of symmetry on their faces. They're not really interested in the gynoid fat deposit.
Yeah, well,
which
I mean,
is what men are
found-
more interested in, but men are interested in symmetry as well. But
well, I mean, women look at.
but yeah, basically this is just at some point it's a kind of blank check.
It is a blank check. I mean, the definition of porn in the Digital Economy Act, basically, yeah, as I say, it can be any image, sexual or just nude, and it doesn't have to be erotic nude. It can be nude, non-erotic nude. So it's likely to cover sex ed and erotic art and things like that. I mean, but furthermore, once this mechanism exists, and it's going to be run by the BBFC, which is the old video censor, once the blocking mechanism exists, an amendment to the act can add hate speech, just like that. It can add extremism, and it will. The porn is being used as a testing ground. Porn isn't particularly special. It's just that it's the hardest thing to defend, and it's the thing that people don't defend, which is why I end up on Newsnight and Radio 4 and stuff like that, because the worthy defenders of free speech won't go and defend pornography because it's too yucky for them, but this is my worry has been when once you have the mechanism, once you have the law, once you have the mechanism, then they can block anything, and the internet's about to change fundamentally, and it's all been done under the excuse of blocking porn.
Arms races, you talk about that on your website and Pub Panic and things like that. We're also going to see that there's going to be an evolutionary tech arms race between the censors and the people, basically. And the censors are always going to be playing catch up.
They are
essentially.
But they've been watching, and they can thank China and Saudi Arabia and Iran for for proofing the technology. And the thing is, you don't need to get the technology perfect, because once you've made it hard enough or underground enough that 10% or 5%, or it's only 2% or 1% of the population are now using these workarounds, then you can threaten people with prison and things like that. And that's what's been done in the world of pornography as well. I mean, Britain's, I think, the only democratic country I know where certain types of categories of pornography you can go to prison for possessing it. That's not just child abuse imagery, which is generally accepted, is valid to censor, but in Britain there's a whole range of stuff, including fetish content, which you can go to prison for possessing, which could mean you've got an image on your phone. So yeah, I mean, they can use just the sheer threat of the sheer fear.
So again, the unforeseen consequences of the kind of tight hand on control is actually is not going to help anybody. It's actually going to make things worse. What we should ask everybody to do is just download Tor on their computer. Then even if they don't use it, just download it, because it might come in handy one day. And if we've all got it, they can't. It's not just certain pockets and little people that they can keep an eye on. If we've all got it.
The thing is, it's very easy to intimidate people. So in the case of the Extreme Porn Act, the Extreme Porn Law, which is the Criminal Justice Act 2008, I think, which was one of Labour's kind of parting gestures. The police don't go looking for it, but if they raid someone for some reason and they find something that's illegal on their phone, they'll do them for that. And you get perfectly ordinary
But the
people.
police don't go looking for anybody. They just full of tips. They full of tip-offs. They don't have the people to to go after people.
They don't.
Yeah,
Have,
but I mean, they have been known to just not like people, you know, like Tommy Robinson. They just went and raided him and looked for anything, and they got him on some kind of like mortgage fraud kind of thing, didn't they? And sent him to prison. But that means, you know, if you are guilty of wrongthink in the state's eyes, you know, there's
and the
just a
fact
whole.
is, you know, even if you persuaded 100,000 people to download porn onto their computers, the first person that goes to prison for 3 years for having the wrong porn on their computer. And as I say, with this, we're not talking about.
Yeah, well, we don't even need to, Jerry, because what's happened to that guy who was in the cabinet who had thumbnails on his computer? How many thumbnails have any of us got on our computer? You know, what happens to reconditioned computers when we buy them from the local computer shop?
Yeah, and the thing is, being branded a sex offender to your neighbors and your family and to the parents in your school playground is synonymous with being a child abuser, and actually it's not. You know, being a sex offender can mean you have a thumbnail of a page that you never looked at in your web browser cache. And there are some pretty nasty cases. There was a case of a gay bloke who stayed in a hotel who looked at a perfectly legal gay porn site. So the next guest in the room found it in the browser history. It was on one of those internet connected TVs. Found it in the browser history. Reported it to the reception. They reported it to the police. They arrested the guy. They took one sample image of a model that was cached, that was on this site, I think, and they said, "We think this model looks under 18. We're going to do you for child porn." And luckily, he managed to trace the studio. He managed to get the records. He managed to find the model's date of birth.
When she actually flew over to prove who she was.
His lawyer had to contact the studio, the porn studio in the US. But this guy was, and what was scary about it was the Crown Prosecution Service. Even when they had the evidence that the model wasn't under 18, they took another 6 months or something to drop the case. This guy's life was ruined. He was branded a sex offender, and you know, this is how a repressive state can work. You know, back in the Soviet Union, people would be labeled mentally ill and put in asylums. You know, that's how they dealt with dissidents. Today, you can be labeled a sex offender, and you're going to get your windows smashed by your neighbors because they don't know that what you were looking at was legal porn rather than something, you know, dark and horrible. So it's a great way for, you know, I equate it to drug possession laws. I think drug possession laws should be scrapped, all of them. But drug possession laws are a fantastic excuse to stop people to go into their pockets, to go into their car, it's one of the reasons why the war on drugs is so toxic. But the state can use that against anybody they want. And just being labeled as a sexual deviant, you know, you can imagine in this increasingly conservative culture we're in the Me Too type culture, you know, what does a deviant mean? What does an abuser mean? Does it mean that that someone's accused you of rape, or does it mean that you put your hand on someone's knee when I'm
kind of hopeful though. 2018, which started with the kind of Peterson Kathy Newman interview, seems to have started off really, really well in the fact that social justice and feminism has pushed itself to the point where it now needs to expose itself to everybody, and it can't pretend that it's liberal and normal and, you know, just about equal rights, and it likes women and it doesn't hate men, and it's exposing itself. And the more it exposes itself, the more we let it expose itself.
I think I think there are positive signs culturally, and then every time I think that culturally maybe the wave is turning. Maybe, you know, more and more people are, for example, on the Me Too thing. You know, if that happened 2 or 3 years ago, no one would dare stand up against that kind of campaign, perfectly mainstream people are standing up against it and saying this has gone too far. So culturally, there are good signs, but at the same time, then I keep looking at the fact that the Digital Economy Act has been passed. It's not going to be unpassed. The British Internet.
Can I just ask, with this digital censorship that's going to be coming in, that is going to annoy a lot of people, and there is obviously going to be a backlash to that. People are going to find a way to look at explicit images. They always, throughout history, they always have, they always will. Can I just ask how long you think that's going to take, and what form that's going to take, and how successful that will be?
I think the first thing that will happen is that when it goes into action in April, May, June, a load of websites are going to be blocked, and that means people just won't be able to access them. And then people will learn from their mates that you can download a VPN and install that, and then you can access your sites again. However, sites that comply with the law won't be blocked. And this is where it's kind of weird and tricky. Sites like Pornhub, all the big porn sites in the world are going to comply with the law. What that means is Pornhub won't be blocked, but you won't be able to get in without proving your age, which means there are going to be different ways of proving your age, but it means probably using a credit card. It might mean entering your passport details or whatever. So what's going to happen on day one is, you'll be able to access the biggest porn sites in the world because they're ready. Millions of other sites will be blocked, including sites that aren't porn. And then people will install VPNs and carry on. The next stage will be that the state will crack down on VPNs. And again, that's happened in China. So, VPN is something that tunnels you through censorship systems. But the government will simply ban the sale of VPNs in the UK unless they block sites that are illegal in the UK. So, yeah, there's a tit for tat technical battle coming, and it depends how repressive the state gets. So, a lot of people, I think, there are a lot of people in the political system and in the that will lose their nerve at some point. The ISPs are going to be complaining. Google will be mounting a fight back. I mean, I think I differ from all of you in that I'm anti-Brexit, but one of the let's not go there. But I mean, one of the things we'll lose by leaving the EU is that actually EU law gives much stronger protections of online free speech than British law is going to afterwards. And EU law, in particular, protects net neutrality, which net neutrality is a mechanism that says all websites have to get through equally. And one of the things that net neutrality stops is states from blocking websites selectively. So by leaving the EU and losing the protection of net neutrality law, unless we bring in our own net neutrality law, we it basically, so the Digital Economy Act, the government's current plans in the UK would be illegal under EU law. So it's kind of a shame that it's kind of bad timing from that perspective.
Smog is up for leadership. Let's just see. That we need to see who's going to possibly, if we're going to have a kind of libertarian, a bit like Trump, which you might not agree with. Certainly, that's going to go against political correctness and that kind of.
I think, I mean, I'm certainly not a Trump fan, and I'm quite, I've
become a Trump fan. I was skeptical at first, but he is such good fun. He's more
fun than I thought. I thought he was a fascist. He's not a libertarian. He's a showman more than anything. But I feel sympathy for the people who voted for Trump, and kind of just to piss off the kind of PC urban type elite. It was almost worth it. But no, I don't think Trump's a good thing personally.
Sorry, can I just backtrack? Because I also have one more question on the subject of censorship. So I think we can all agree that children shouldn't be looking at pornography. My point of view is that it should be the parent's responsibility, and if you want to make something an offence, it should actually be an offence to allow a child to have access to a device that doesn't have adult controls on it. That's my personal opinion. So what's your opinion on that, on how we should keep children away from pornographic imagery? And also my job used to be, I used to work for a tech company, and my job was in age verification. And so, for example, a passport or a credit card, it is just an algorithm check. So you enter a valid passport number, and it checks kind of, it doesn't know who you are. It just checks that it's a real passport code and this kind of stuff. So obviously it's not infallible, but there are these ways of doing adult checks. So yeah, I'm just wondering what your opinion is about how we should stop children from looking at porn.
Yeah, I mean, we've had the tools to block children. Things like Net Nanny have been around almost as long as the web's been around, since the mid-late 90s. There have been decent tools that you can install on your kids' devices. And so, yeah, for sure, these things need to be done. Google have brought out a nice family, I can't remember what it's called, but it's only out in the US and New Zealand and Ireland at the moment. But the minute it comes out in the UK, I'm going to install it on my son's tablet. And not only does it give you really good kind of filtering that you can manage yourself, but it also links the Google account to the parent account, and it mails you what the parent, you have access to what the child's been doing. You get weekly reports of their accesses.
You can do that anyway in Google. I've done that on my son's.
I think the problem is that the government knows that many children are much more computer literate than their parents, and children are, and I think this kind of does go back to this nanny state that wants to come in and decide what's best for people and interfere with their freedoms.
Yeah. Well, the age verification thing does sound very compelling, and this is why this has been the way that censorship has been introduced. So what they've said is, unless porn sites age verify, we're gonna block them, and that sounds very reasonable.
Can I just jump in and ask both you, Jerry, and Catherine actually a question on age verification, because I would be very concerned about putting my card details into a website, or my passport details especially. Like that seems like a security risk to me.
Yeah, there's a big privacy implication, which to me I kind of don't focus on that so much, because there are so many bigger issues around free speech, but there's a huge privacy issue, and a lot of people will stop looking at porn because they're scared of that people will be able to that there'll be a record somewhere of what they look at. Is that kind of that brother thing?
I mean, also my job, it was actually for an online game. It was a gaming thing, so it had to be adult. It had to be adults, because obviously children and gambling, big no-no, of course. Yeah. But I, as you know, when it was my job, I was a person sitting in an office, and my whole job was actually making sure that people's data that they were giving us certainly wasn't accessible by anyone. Was only because there's a rule in the Data Protection Act that you can only keep information that is relevant, and you can only keep it for a certain amount of time that it's relevant.
Yeah.
But then you also have to be able to prove that you have that information about your customers, so you are walking that line. But people would have gone to jail, if there was an information security breach. But as a person who's sitting there with your credit card, particularly if you're trying to access adult material, you don't know that there's a person in an office making sure that happens. You don't know if the person, particularly with the credit card, they're just trying to nick your credit card. So I think that would stop probably a majority of people.
Yeah, and you don't know where the site's from either.
No, and you don't know if hackers can get to it, even if the company has good data protection procedures and so on. And one of the, Pornhub, which is run by a company called Manwin, which owns a vast section of the porn industry, is going to be doing its own age verification checks. So we don't really know how they're going to manage their data, or where in the world it's going to be stored. I guess that kind of brings me onto kind of one of the things that I get to later in the book, because the book's not necessarily about defending porn, but I felt it was worth defending porn. You know, the book's about defending free speech, whether it's good or bad speech. And so to an extent, I defend people's right to look at porn, whether it's good or bad. However, I also look at the evidence of porn and harm, and overwhelmingly, the evidence suggests that actually porn is beneficial to societies. So forgetting at the individual level for a minute, you know, access to porn correlates with rapid declines in child abuse, with rapid declines in sexual violence. And there are some really good studies that have happened around the world over the last 30 years or so. And I cover a few of them in the book. There's one particularly interesting one, which is the fall of communism in the Czech Republic, where because it was a revolution in 1989, and so the revolution swept away censorship controls. They didn't just topple communism, they banned every censorship law that the state had in place because they were so sick of repression. And what followed in the Czech Republic was a massive decline in sexual violence. But I mean, that's been seen on a slower scale in America.
Yeah, well, when you mention America in the book, because various states have slightly different laws, that's a really useful kind of test case, isn't it? You know, and so places where it is more easily available do have lower rates of rape and stuff like that.
Yeah, and they found that the more technical states and the more urban states where the internet was adopted more quickly in the 90s saw steeper declines in sexual violence than the states that were more rural and where internet take-up was slower. And there have been some really, really good studies, and the UK government has done its own studies on this and then quickly hushed them up. But you know, the UK government's done studies in I think 2005 and 2011. They've done meta studies, so they've gone to other European governments. They've done
links to those studies, because I've not seen those studies.
Sorry.
Do you have links to those studies? I've just not seen those studies, because I know the correlations.
I think
really
I can
strong.
find them actually. They're all in the book, aren't they?
I think I mentioned them in the book.
We'll get them in the description.
I know, Jerry, you asked me to review your book a few years ago. I just found that message for you on Twitter, and I completely forgot. I just didn't. If I don't do something immediately when somebody asks me to do it, it just goes into the ether. Sorry, but yeah, I mean, because I know the correlations are strong, but we're not. The evidence isn't there to just link up the causation just.
No,
yet,
there is.
But
no,
yeah, I mean,
there is some
promising. But yeah.
The correlations are very strong. There is some causative stuff, and there are lots of psychologists working on this. And I talk quite a lot to. There's a psychologist in New Mexico called Dr. David Lay, who's a specialist in porn.
Oh,
and porn usage.
He's a member of Darwinian Gender Studies. Yeah.
And he's convinced, you know, first of all, that overwhelmingly pornography appears to be a positive thing. There is problematic use of porn. There are people who use porn problematically, but there are people who eat problematically and shop problematically and so on. These are compulsive behaviors, and he's particularly determined to say this is not addiction. You know, addiction is about drugs, and it's about certain chemicals and the effects they have on your body. The way people.
Last name is Lay, and he talks about porn. These researchers all, you know, like kind of Randy, great. They've all got really funnily kind of ironic names.
Yeah.
David Dawn.
To be honest, I'm probably so jaded. I don't think I'd even spotted it before. But yeah. I spend my life immersed in porn people, you know, and stuff. But I mean, you know, back to, you know, my own kids. I'm going to do absolutely everything I can to stop them accessing this content for as long as possible.
Well, to be devil's advocate for a little bit, because I mean, you know, when was the first time you ever saw a pornographic image? And you know what I mean? I mean, like kind of mucous membrane. I don't mean erotic. I mean, kind of you saw a penis entering a vagina, and you saw the mucous membranes. And how old were you when you saw that?
I think I was 12, and it was. I mean, this would have been like 1977 or something. But
like hedgerow porn. Did you know?
It was a friend's older stepbrother who had some imported Scandinavian magazines. These magazines were illegal in the UK. Actually, pornography was legal in the UK till about the year 2000.
What about Elizabeth and Catherine? How old were you?
About 12 or 13, yeah.
I can't
Catherine?
remember. Sorry.
I was about 12. I was on my way to church and I found, me and my friend found a porn magazine in the hedgerow. And we were all over it. We were like, oh my God, she looks like she's in pain. Oh, what's good? But we were fascinated. And I think, you know, it hasn't done us any harm. And I know that it's different kind of when we worry about the compulsive nature of just being able to switch on the dopamine hits of that instant gratification online and what have you. But just to play devil's advocate, you know, I've got a young son who I know, you know, we've got all of the protections on the internet and stuff, and he still comes across it. People at school whose parents don't have those protections, you know, when they're having sleepovers and stuff, end up a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is,
and I wonder if a parent, like, you know, about how we react if they see those things, because what I've never done is kind of just hit the roof and said, you know, that's ridiculous, that's horrible, that's disgusting. It's just kind of, oh well, that's what it is. It's not reality. And you know, you're going to be growing up and you're going to be feeling a lot of things, and he's kind of grown out of it. It's kind of.
The problem is that, according to the government, they need to be they can't see this until they turn 18, and I think that's damaging, because, you know, because they're including.
Teenagers are fascinated with sex. They're gonna see it, whether we want them to see it or not.
I think, I mean, from the minute I hit puberty, it's been non-stop since then, really, and you know, it's just kind of slowed down.
Helping them, maybe it's not stop. Maybe it's obviously stopping the flow of it, being able to see it, but also helping them interpret what they're seeing.
That's important, and you know, there are lots of movement for ethical porn and for good porn, and the thing is, kids will look out, you know, teenagers will seek out what they're interested in, and as psychologists will point out, there's this idea that you go down a spiral of worse and worse and worse, and the reality is that that's actually unlikely. People see something they don't like and they don't go back to it, you know, and they see something they like and they do go back to it, and it's but yeah, this has been a problem since puberty was invented, however many million years ago, and it continues to be a problem, and porn just kind of highlights it, I think.
I hope Adam was listening then. We did get a tweet from Adam earlier asking, how do we suggest parents guide adults in this stage of ubiquitous online pornography? Are there any more points to add on that?
How do we?
I think just, you know,
download the Censorship.
If you bring download the kind of filters and all of that, and I think
I mean, you can't stop them.
Bring your child,
and when they, you know, when you eventually catch them, you know, watching it or on the phone or whatever, you know, just don't hit the roof. Just explain what it is, and explain that it's not reality. It's
but some of it's just, sometimes it's just stills.
I think.
I remember years ago, a friend of mine phoned me because her mum, she was goddaughter to a girl, 13-year-old girl, and the mum had phoned her as godmother, and she didn't know. So she phoned me and she said, my goddaughter has been looking at porn on her PC. She's been looking at gay male porn on her PC. What does this mean? And I said, well, typically gay porn has hotter men with better abs and six packs and stuff, so that's why she's probably seeking out kind of gay imagery. But it's, you know, I mean, 13-year-old is finding naked images interesting. I couldn't find anything less surprising, you know.
I think one of the things that haunts me as a story, my partner Steve told me from when he was at school, that one of his friends, when they were about 12 or 13 again, they discovered, you know, as you do, wherever you discover it, you see it. And this kid had a stash under his bed, and his parents found it, and he killed himself because he was so ashamed that he couldn't face them about what he hung himself at a metro station in Newcastle.
That's the stigma. I mean, my mum actually found some under my mattress, and I was utterly mortified. But but then I had a kind of she was the kind of mum who'd think that was funny, which was annoying, but it wasn't traumatic.
That's exactly what I've tried to do with William. It's kind of, if I find it's kind of perfectly natural, you know, but just, or you know, it's just don't make it happen.
My opinion is also that the fact that the way that people access a lot of pornography is that it's free because they don't want to give their credit card or whatever. That means the nature of what they're consuming can be sort of really low quality or whatever. I wonder if we took away the stigma and kind of made it okay to pay for access to that kind of material, and everyone, you know, it's like having a subscription to anything else. Maybe that would make a lot of these issues go away. I wonder what your opinion is about that.
Yeah, I mean, the porn industry is actually mostly behind these censorship laws because they want people to start paying for obvious reasons.
I've been thinking about that kind of, because in this day and age, there's so much amateur porn. How do professional pornographers make any money?
They don't.
The big ones.
They used to.
The big ones do have websites that you pay subscriptions to, though, don't they? You know, if you go to like sashagray.com or something like that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's still commercial porn, but the market's tiny compared to 10 years ago before the free sites came along. But this is this is the same problem that newspapers, music companies, and so on are experiencing. First, partly due to piracy, but partly just because it's so cheap to make content these days. And the fact is, a lot of wannabe musicians are creating pretty good music at home on their own and putting it out there for free to get famous, and killing the music industry in the same way that free porn's killing the porn industry. I mean, the budgets, there used to be $1 million budgets for one movie in the 1970s, for one porn movie in the 1970s, and they had plots, they had acting, they had location. You know, these were big budget films. No, I don't think there's that much demand for that kind of thing. You know, porn is masturbation material primarily, and people are looking for that for a few minutes of whatever turns them on. Yeah. And there's a lot of people find amateur stuff filmed on a phone sexier than professional stuff filmed in a studio. And I've been in porn studios, and they're really unsexy environments. And, you know, it's kind of, I possibly because I've been around the industry, I don't find very professionally made porn very sexy, because I can imagine the camera crew and the sound engine people and stuff standing there, you know, behind the scenes.
I think I'd just like to make one last point on the kind of issue of children and pornography. I think that you can insulate them from a lot of kind of harm if you just bring them up to respect and be sensitive to other people's needs. You know, I mean, all of my friends were accessing porn from kind of 12 or 13 online. And they're all really nice and had very healthy, normal sex lives.
The issue of consent,
don't think nothing means.
Yeah, I think the issue of consent isn't a sexual issue. The issue of consent is about how you regard other people ethically, and you know, people who are likely to commit sexual violence are probably also likely to commit other forms of violence and other forms of antisocial behavior. But, you know, again, you know, the idea of stealing is most people find it difficult to steal or to do other things. You know, it's a general it's a general ethical issue about how you treat people. What was I going to say? But yeah, as I say, I wrote a chapter on really summarizing some of the evidence and of harm, and I think that was important to do, because the anti-porn groups suggest harm. And I've been in so many debates in universities and on the radio and things, countering these harm arguments all the time. And I mean, actually, anti-sex feminist groups like Object have continually been retreating. So they started out saying it harms the women in the industry, but then the women in the industry would just come out and say, no, it doesn't. I enjoy my job. Leave me alone. So then they would say it harms it harms the viewers, and then it causes erectile dysfunction and a bunch of stuff that's not very well backed.
People like Gail Dine have been big anti-porn kind of activists, and they kind of she's been quiet for a few. I don't know what's happening there, but I'm just to say, just personally, I'm kind of as vanilla as you come. I kind of don't watch a great deal of porn at all, really, and but I'm absolutely just pro whatever gets you through the night. Whatever turns you on, whatever you want to do, as long as it's not hurting anybody else. It's not that I'm in the kind of fetish or BDSM or anything like that. I'm absolutely vanilla, just stupid white cis hetero woman, and not into any of that at all. But I absolutely kind of support the right of people who are not like me to express themselves and be allowed to express themselves.
There's an evolutionary point here. Back to the evolutionary stuff and the male-female differences. It's an absolute fact that there is more male demand for sex than there's female supply of sex. This is why women get paid for sex more than men, and so on.
Yeah.
But porn is one of the things that closes that gap and that makes men less dangerous. And evolution's caused us a problem, which is there are roughly equal numbers of men and women, and no sane person would have created roughly equal numbers of men and women, and then given men a great the demand, the drive to have more sex.
Different. So some people have to, like brilliant people like Steven Pinker and his wife decide not to reproduce, decide to become evolutionary, and even though they are, it just because if you want to leave a legacy, having a child is not the only way to do that. Although it is, unless you're absolutely extraordinary, it's not something that
we all
advise
decide.
you to.
I'm 52 and I've only had 3 kids, which is a fairly low ratio compared to the number of times I've had sex. So we all decide not to have as many kids as our ancestors did 10,000 years ago, but because we have the tools to stop us doing that. But at the same time, one of the ways that men reduce their need for sex is and women, and as well as through masturbation. And one of the things, it's got to be remembered that's what porn is. It's an aid to masturbation, and that's not a bad thing. It's probably healthy physically and mentally.
I think I'd just like to jump in on Paula's point about letting everybody have their own likes and preferences and whatever. Question from Liz on Twitter that relates to that directly. She asks, is watching porn at work, including the House of Commons, wrong, unprofessional, that sexualities are like opinions and everybody has one?
No, that's unprofessional. Yeah, you don't want to be looking at someone's mucous membranes when you're kind of over the desk, when you kind of have a serious conversation about, I don't know, reordering paper or something.
I'm not 100% sure. I think first of all it depends what you mean by porn, because I think that for a lot of modern couples, part of the foreplay that they have is maybe sending each other little images and clips throughout the day. So if someone's partner sends them a little image or a clip, I don't see anything wrong in them viewing that briefly. And what
I
about,
think
what about if it's
really
lunchtime?
in a professional environment.
Lunchtime and in their office, and for them to go on Facebook. Well, sure. Well, if they feel like watching some porn, is that really a problem? I'm not sure.
Think so. I think there's a time and a place for really intimate stuff like that gets your juices going. I think that's my definition of professionalism. It's kind of keeping an emotional distance from people, and once you get into kind of those kinds of things, it's impossible to do that. Lots of people kind of get turned on by things, and or by images, and kind of they misinterpret the kind of signs that they're and symptoms that are experiencing themselves. It's just, I think
being horny at work probably isn't very useful for work.
Yeah,
and I can understand why in that kind of environment why women might generally feel weirded out by the idea that guys are doing that. I've got sympathy for that. I'm not sure it's harmful, but yeah, I mean, it's perfectly valid to kind of have workplace rules like that. I think, having said that, I mean, I've got friends, on WhatsApp groups. It depends what you call porn, because there's always kind of erotic kind of stuff floating around between friends on WhatsApp, and between on all male WhatsApp groups and that kind of thing I'm on.
Between someone sending you a rude picture on WhatsApp and going to an adult site.
Yeah.
On
yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not a good place to be looking at porn, and there's being horny at work isn't particularly useful for you, or probably the people you work with, or it's probably not a good idea.
We also had one other question on the chat earlier, which I think someone was asking, was there a particular moment that made you decide to write the book? Was there one sort of light bulb moment?
It was kind of like, it was just like this. I was blogging about all these different strands that I've talked about: identity politics, the kind of the sex workers I knew, the stripper activists, and the decline of the left, and the rise of what I felt. It was just all of these things that kind of that I just realized I can't explain this in blog posts. I'm going to have to write this as a narrative. But probably, actually, the podcast I did in 2012 with the two strippers, interviews with the two strippers, I actually republished that on Sex and Censorship's podcast yesterday. So I 6 years on, because and I actually saw Edie yesterday, weirdly enough, but it was Edie's. She's very articulate, and she saw Object and the rise of those groups as a threat to civil liberties in general. So I think it was probably meeting her and hearing about the East London Strippers campaign, and having her put it into perspective that this is a massive backlash against women's rights to sexual expression, self-determination. So yeah, I think she's
slipping. Massive feminism is slipping, and it's showing itself basically just to be an authoritarian just movement to control other women and other women's sexuality, in order, and yes, that because they want power to control society, and women's sexuality is the, I guess, most powerful kind of resource.
Yeah, I mean, actually,
in human.
There was one other one, which was another friend of mine who was a stripper and a porn star, and she also ran private stag parties as a business. So she would take strippers to private stag parties. Really lovely girl, kind of, again, very, a businesswoman, very, very certain that she was doing what she wanted to do and enjoyed her work and so on. She was personally picked out and harassed by Object, and they stalked her, and they would call her on her way to jobs and say, we know where you're going, we know your home address, we know where your family live, and things and so on. That was, I found particularly disgusting. That was one of the things that made me want to take them on as well.
Well, that's what the research shows about kind of bullying at schools. Girls slut shame each other. Boys kind of gay shame. Boys will kind of mock other boys, and call them, gay, puff, if they're not kind of up to that kind of standard of competition and what have you in sports and stuff, which is kind of traumatic for boys who suspect they might be gay, and girls slut shame their rivals. It's not, and they kind of they'll recruit boys to help them do that, but it's girls who are the prime kind of movers in that kind of in that bullying.
Yeah.
That was one of the nails in the coffin for me, calling myself a feminist, actually. Just seeing the bullying of kind of glamour models and so on and so forth on social media by feminists. I was absolutely horrified.
Yeah, and their male supporters. And when I argue with these guys, I just think, they have no argument at all except to produce the word objectification when they run out of and actually it's a real scream of rage. They hate the fact that these beautiful women are walking around half naked or
empowered by objectifying themselves. You probably come across the research as well that shows that when men actually look at pornography, they're not objectifying the model at all. They're looking primarily at the model's face for signs of genuine arousal and enjoyment.
Yeah, the men are making eye contact, trying to make eye contact with a photo, which isn't
which is the opposite of objectification. And then when they look at what women are looking at in pornography, they're the ones looking at mucous membranes and bits and objects of what's going on there. We don't know, but men are certainly not objectifying.
Women may be looking at it. Women may be getting turned on, but they're also looking at potential competitors, and they're looking at other women's body shapes and the way other women dress. And
I think as I say, female intersexual competition is the pink elephant in the feminist room, and they really need to wise up to that.
I'm sure I read something. It might have been in The Selfish Gene or something, but I can't remember where it was, about female baboons that would turn on young sluts basically in the group and beat the crap out of them. And and I've been trying to find this reference again ever since, but it's not just human behavior.
No. It's probably going to be in Hardy. I think Sarah Hardy did most of the research on the baboons, but the female competition it's brutal. It's forced beatings, kind of in apes, humans are actually quite unique in the fact that when we as apes, when we have babies, we hand our babies to other females, because we're partially kind of cooperative breeding kind of species where we need the help of allo mothers and whoever they might be. They might be kind of kin partners. It doesn't have to be a mother. It doesn't have to be female. Allo mothers can be anybody who's kind of helping you bring up your child. The dyad isn't actually enough to bring up altrical kind of human children. But in other apes and monkeys, it's really, really rare for a monkey to hand over their infant to another female,
because she might kill it.
Because 99.9% of the time she will kill it. Most of the time, apes, our ape cousins, do not let go of their young at all.
Yeah,
we are with them. We are very unique in the species in that matter.
Yeah, whereas actually male infanticide is quite normal in humans, or at least it was, in pre civilized societies, where men would kill other men's children with perfectly rational ends of kind of reducing competition for their own genes. And this is one of the reasons why women may be promiscuous.
There's a really horrible kind of anecdote in Hardy kind of relates in one of the books about the Yamamoto, I think, in South America, where one of the mothers kind of says, you know, they came and they smashed our babies' heads on the rocks, and we begged them not to, but you know, it's the trials and struggles that our ancestors went through, you know, just in here. Into the kind of
it's in the Old Testament, you know. I mean, God often, you know, God would tell the Israelites to go and kill the boys and men and take the women and girls as prizes. You know, it was perfectly normal behavior.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we could probably go on for another hour on biology, but maybe we should invite you back, Jerry, for another chat
That would be
more
great.
on that kind of subject, because
yeah.
we've been going for about 2 hours now, and I'm aware everyone must be.
10.
Sorry, I have to say goodbye. My son's having a meltdown. Wonderful to speak to you.
Bye, Catherine.
Bye, Catherine.
Okay. Yeah.
It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for coming on, Jerry.
Thanks for the invitation.